After the runaway success of our Superman origin story comparison, we're going back to the well this week. Spider-Man Origins in comparison, up next. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds, welcome to episode 196 of the Nerd Byword Podcast. The countdown to episode 200 continues. This week, we are looking at 3 different origin stories for the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and comparing and contrasting the 3 different origins. Which one do we like the best? We will make our call. But first, as always, it is time for... Chris, what's new in the world of nerddom?
So we got, as of the time of recording, our first trailer for Batman Caped Crusader, which is the spiritual successor to Batman the Animated Series, produced by Bruce Timm and Matt Reeves. Highly anticipated. We were worrying about its fate a couple months back because Warner, Discovery, whatever they want to call themselves nowadays, was kind of pawning this off, and Amazon Prime picked it up, and so that is set to debut on August the 1st. And in a move that's kind of rare nowadays, I'm glad we didn't get a trailer until, like a month or two before release. So that's kind of exciting. I'm kind of over revealing everything, but I'm very stoked about this. I think the voice cast is very, very interesting. You've got longtime Batman voice actor Dietrich Bader being Harvey Dent here. You got Hamish Linklater as Batman. You got Christina Ricci, all the 90s kids swoon here as Catwoman. Jamie Chung as Harley Quinn, which I'm fascinated to see more of that. I'm really, really excited about this. They're really leaning into the noir vibe with this from the looks of the trailer, and they are like the bat suit, all of the suits really, Catwoman as well, looks very 30s ish. So I'm very excited about this, and Batman kind of being an enemy of the police, little Spider-Man influence, if you will. So I'm very intrigued by this, and can't wait for August.
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating trailer. I watched it a couple of times, and design-wise, it very much harkens back to a very, 30s and 40s designs. Catwoman in particular is a real standout for being back in a very traditional old-school outfit. And then, you got the really short gloves on Batman and the kind of more bendy ears, like they're a little more bent than straight up. Like a lot of the design elements are very 1930s. And I think that's really cool, actually. It's iffy because the animation style is very, very close. I would say almost identical to Batman the Animated Series, like that sort of what they back then dubbed Dark Deco style, right? And so I'm almost wondering if it's going to do enough just with changing some design elements, with really distinguishing itself from that series, because that's a real watershed animated series and a very high bar to live up to. Also, as far as I know, Paul Dini is not involved in any way, shape, or form on this one, and that's a big bummer if this is supposed to be sort of the spiritual successor, right?
You know who is?
Dini to
Greg
me is
Rucka.
yeah,
Greg Rucka wrote 9 episodes.
that's really exciting to me. But if you're gonna make this a spiritual successor of Batman the Animated Series, Dini is sort of the gold standard of that series, right? And so not having him involved in all is kind of a little sad to me. Rucka being there, though, may make up for it. One way or another, it's definitely a very interesting looking series right now. As always, I reserve judgment. The trailer doesn't tell you everything until I actually see an episode and kind of can form my own opinion on it. I know in an interview, I think it was Bruce Timm that actually said that they can be a little more mature with this one and are not so hampered by having to make it a kids program like they did with Batman the Animated Series. But I think
And you see that in the trailer. Like I'm thinking of like the dead bodies with the spiders crawling across the
Yeah,
eyes and
and
everything.
on the one hand, that's neat that they don't feel hamstrung. But on the other hand, I think I've learned over the years, the older I'm getting now, that limitations are oftentimes a good thing. Like when you give somebody
Hmm.
a vast beach of sand to play with, then they meander off and they're not very focused sometimes, and things don't get to be as, I don't know, clean, I guess, sometimes, than when you give them just a small sandbox to play in. Limitations are oftentimes a good thing, right? Um,
That's you becoming a parent in recent years as
maybe
well.
so, but I also think of somebody like George Lucas, right, who had to deal with a whole bunch of like
Yeah.
limitations on the original Star Wars trilogy, and that led to a whole bunch of real, inventiveness in how things were filmed, and then how he comes back with the special edition and has to like fiddle faddle with things when the limitations actually came, created really interesting shots. He had to come in and try to like, and that kind of thing. I'm always I'm always cautious when somebody says, "Well, I used to be limited and now I can really cut loose." I'm like, "Dude, I really like that limit.
This is me
I really
unleash,
like that. I really
unleash.
like that leash thing you did. So maybe somebody get you a leash again, okay? Maybe we could do better if we just leash you back up." So, cautiously optimistic. I'm definitely looking forward to watching it.
All right, we may have to change the name of this segment for this ongoing story that you're continuing to cover.
Yeah, I continue to be fascinated just with the moves Nintendo is making recently. I could call it the Nintendo legal hour with Dave, maybe. Um, but it turns out that Nintendo recently held its shareholder meeting, and the CEO of Nintendo of Japan, Shuntaro Furukawa, had some interesting updates regarding the Switch 2, which hasn't really kind of been officially announced yet, but it's been hinted at, and it's kind of sort of an open secret at this point that the Switch 2 will be launching next year sometime, with a lot of insiders speculating it'll probably be sometime in spring. So there's definitely something new on the horizon, right? And at this shareholder meeting, the Switch 2 was specifically addressed. One of the things that shareholders have been concerned about is specifically shortages, right? Famously, when the Switch launched, there were massive shortages of the Switch, and then when the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and Series S launched, there were shortages of those consoles because of COVID-19 and a chip shortage that was going on globally during that time. And so, shortages in particular have been a real concern for Nintendo shareholders. And so, Furukawa then went on the record as saying that Nintendo plans to ship 10 million units of the Switch 2 within the first year alone to make sure that the console is widely available. So apparently they have been stockpiling chips and semiconductors. I think semiconductors were another issue that there was a shortage recently, to make sure that they were able to produce 10 million units of the Switch 2. But what brings this into Dave's legal hour, our litigious Nintendo, apparently also is now going to be taking aim at scalpers potentially. The first time that I actually might be siding with Nintendo's lawyers on an issue, right? Because resale, when there's a scarcity on a console, is always a really big problem. And oftentimes you will find a $300 console like the Nintendo Switch being sold for $600 to $800 on eBay as people, run into a store and snatch up 10 of them and then just make massive profit. And this is apparently something that Nintendo is not appreciating either. And in fact, it is considering legal actions against resellers in order to keep the Switch 2 affordable. That I find that incredibly interesting. Furukawa noted that the company is exploring different legal strategies tailored to each region to effectively tackle the resale problem. So whatever that might mean and what kind of shape that might take is anybody's guess at this point. In an unrelated but interesting note, Nintendo has confirmed that it will continue supporting the current generation after the new model launches, so there's going to still be some ongoing third-party support. And games that work on both systems, so existing customers won't miss out. There's a lot of speculation going around right now, for example, that Metroid Prime 4 will be one of those dual generation releases that you'll be able to buy for both the original Switch and the Switch 2, kind of like how you were able to get Breath of the Wild for the Wii U and the Switch both. No word yet on backwards compatibility, which I think has been the thing that's really interesting a lot of people right now, whether the Switch 2 will be able to play original Switch games. That one I'm watching with a close eye because I'm a big fan of backwards compatibility. But here we go, Nintendo potentially going after scalpers, which I think is actually a really interesting place for us to be as gamers. That we actually might be cheering on Nintendo's lawyers for a change. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, like it's like that meme where like the worst person you know made a valid point. It's just like we like this is the one time that you may be like I'll allow it. Um I'm still kind of upset that I just bought a Switch OLED around the holidays. So I'm still kind of upset about that and spending all this money on it. So, but other than that, I think it'll be interesting to see the backwards compatibility thing, especially because if anybody's going to nickel and dime you, it's Nintendo. With keeping Nintendo only games, keeping Smash Brothers, keeping the Mario games at full price forever and ever and ever and ever. So, it doesn't like my gut instinct tells me that they're going to want to get your money again for those games. So backwards compatibility, just my gut tells me no. Um, so it's going to be really interesting. I think I'm pretty sure Xbox is still doing that with the dual releases, with the Series S and X and the playable on Xbox One version. So I'm wondering if Nintendo will follow suit for as extended a period of time as Microsoft has continued to do that.
Yeah, difficult to say right now. I think there's definitely change in the air in the gaming industry, especially with like Microsoft starting to release some of its exclusive franchises on other platforms, right? I think I think the shape of what people like to think of as the console war is definitely changing. So the whole gaming landscape is really interesting right now, and definitely something to keep an eye on. Alrighty, folks, there you have it. That's it for Nerd News. What are your thoughts on Nintendo aiming their legal team at scalpers? Or what are your thoughts about the trailer for Batman Caped Crusader? Find us on social media. Let us know at Nerd Byword or individually at That Nerd Dave and at That Nerd Chris. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, it's time for the Byword Big Talk when we break down 3 Spider-Man origin stories. So stick around. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds, we're back, and it's once again time for the massive, the huge, Big Talk! And in this week's Big Talk, we're going back to the well. We had a lot of fun recently discussing various origin stories published in comic books for Superman, and which origin story we thought worked best and why. And so we decided to go back to this and look at another long-running classic character and 3 different versions of his origin. And hopefully we will once again find one that resonates the most with us. So this week, we're taking a closer look at our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, Peter Parker. We're going to be looking at the original origin as written by Stan Lee with art by Steve Ditko, which was originally published in Amazing Fantasy 15. And to give that origin a little bit more heft, we're also going to be looking at Amazing Spider-Man numbers 1 through 5. All of this, of course, published between 1962 and 1963. Next, we will fast forward to the late 90s. What a time to be alive and read comic books. When Marvel decided to try to update Spider-Man's origin with Spider-Man Chapter 1, a 12-issue maxi series, including a 0 issue, which was written and drawn by John Byrne, making a return appearance on the Byword here after his Man of Steel miniseries for the Superman Origin episode. And finally, not too long after that, we're going to take a closer look at Ultimate Spider-Man, Volume 1, issues 1 through 6, with a story by Bill Jemas, Brian Michael Bendis, with art by Mark Bagley, which is another attempt to update Spider-Man's origin, but this time not something that was meant to replace the Peter Parker's origin story in 616, but instead being an alternate universe tale of a younger Spider-Man. Now, Chris, that was a lot of origins that we chewed through over the past few days. Let's go ahead and start with the classic, the original Amazing Fantasy 15 and Amazing Spider-Man number 1 through 5. What was your take on this particular origin story?
Well, it's always interesting, and this is something we did not get with our Superman episode. Perhaps we can punt back um, at a later date, but this is like the origin of all origins. And so seeing the actual kind of crucible in which this character and this whole universe was created was really, really fascinating to see. As I've shared time and time again on this show, as a language nerd, as a culture nerd, I'm always fascinated with the beginnings of things, where things come from. And so seeing this character that I love so much and kind of like is like this fledgling character, and especially when you do research behind the scenes of you know where Marvel Comics was at the time, they were just kind of throwing stuff together, and this one was this one that stuck. And you can it's interesting because you can see um kind of the warts and the growing pains of this character as they were continuing to build this out as a true origin. um because you see in the second issue we have Peter Palmer the entire issue, instead of Peter Parker. And then I'd totally forgotten about Now Magazine, the other business endeavor, the other publication of J. Jonah Jameson. So I'd totally forgotten about that. Um, and just how it's not a perfect story, but when you look at what it birthed and what it helped to create for the future of this character is really, really fascinating, and I think one of the strongest origin stories you could ever find in comic books.
You know, it's interesting because obviously some of the stuff is dated, but
Hmm.
I have to say, Amazing Fantasy 15 in particular, I love the efficiency of that story. It's like what, 11
Yes.
pages, and it just
Yes.
like there is so much on each page. There's so much going on, and it never feels truncated, right? It never feels like there's like
Hmm.
huge pieces of story missing or something. It moves at a really brisk pace. It tells its story, you know. And in the age of decompression, right, that we live in these days, I was absolutely mind blown. I cannot lie, mind blown. That it was so efficient in 11 pages. I was like, it's really it's easy to forget sometimes how efficient storytelling was back in the day, right?
You know what's fascinating? I'm not typically someone who revisits things, even some of my favorite things, because I already know how the story's going to end. I don't replay video games. I don't reread stuff sometimes. I have exceptions that are my absolute favorites. I'll read The Count of Monte Cristo time and again. It's about high time for another reread, in fact. Um, but sometimes when you do revisit things, you do rewatch things, you pick up things that you didn't see the first time. And this is probably the third or fourth time that I've read these issues. And you know what I really picked up on? My biggest takeaway was, holy crap, you used to get so much bang for your buck with these books. There's so much packed. It took me almost as long to read Byrne's 12 issue, 13 if you include zero. It took me almost as long to read those 13 issues as it did these 6 issues, because there's so much here. even within the span of the 20 to 25 pages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, just as somebody who's not looked at these stories in a really, really long time, it was kind of mind blowing to me too, just pound for pound, how each issue in this original run is just absolutely a banger, right? Like every issue introduces some kind of like legendary long running character, like, oh, look, there's the Sandman. Oh, look, there's J. Jonah Jameson. Oh, look, there's the Vulture, right? Like, it's like none of these issues missed, right? Like every one of these
Mhm.
characters introduced is still around in some capacity. Um, that kind of blew my mind, to be honest with you. Like it just
Even
stuck,
even
right?
even the Tinkerer and his crazy alien invasion.
Exactly. Even the Tinker is still around. Yeah. So I have to say, overall, I like this origin. Obviously, it's dated, right? I mean, we're gonna have to face that head on, right? It's not as dated as something like an original Superman or Batman origin from the 30s, obviously. And I think we have a lot less of an issue connecting to storytelling from the 60s, but it is very much dated. And the kind of bullying, for example, that Peter experiences here, especially in Amazing Fantasy 15, is pretty mild overall compared to some of the stuff that kids experience these days,
Oh my
right?
God, yeah.
Yeah. So seeing him as this like put upon kid is a little more difficult in this particular series before he gets his powers, right?
Like they don't want to go get a milkshake with him or a malt, and I'm like, oh darn, yeah. And then you can't you not to put the carts before the horse, but you contrast that with what happens in Ultimate Spider-Man, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty mild. The other thing that was really interesting to see, and as history nerds, we can pick up on this pretty quickly, is kind of the effects of it being written in the 60s, like the red scare, like the cold war aspects to it, of like radiation and atomic stuff. So that was fascinating to see kind of how that played out as well.
Oh, very much so. Like there was obviously a lot of radiation stuff in going on in Marvel Comics, anyways, at that time, right? There's gamma radiation with the Hulk and everything. Radiation had to do with Peter Parker's origin story. There was a lot of radiation stuff going on. Yeah, absolutely. All right, I guess that then brings us to our next origin story, and I have a funny feeling we're going to have a lot more to say about
Ooh.
Spider-Man Chapter One, which was both written and drawn by our old friend John Byrne. And this one is difficult. I'm not gonna lie to talk about because it's a very, very odd series. It ran for 12 issues with a zero issue that was, I think, like wedged between issue 6 and 7. Um, so odd reading order, anyways. But what we got here is sort of a retelling of the original Lee Ditko run, with an attempt to sort of bring it into the late 90s. Whether that was successful or not, I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor first, Chris. What were your thoughts on John Byrne's Spider Man Chapter 1?
Why? 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 No, in all seriousness, like this is like a this is like a karaoke version of Lee Ditko. And it's like someone who sings karaoke and thinks they're better than they are, and like they're trying to do all these extra runs that aren't in the song. Like I'm looking at the pages for the spider bite, which also turns into an explosion, which also like shivs Doc Ock's origin in there. Now, Ultimate does something similar, but we'll get to that in a moment. But it's much better executed. Um, but there's just nothing fresh and original about this. It also has the most annoying aspect of every issue is that. almost every single time they're opening with this big page right in somebody's face or right in an action scene. And it's, I bet you're wondering how I got here trope. And then it kind of goes back to 30 minutes before or an hour before or earlier that day. And that can be utilized sometimes. But when it's every single issue of a 12 issue maxi series, it gets really old really fast. So there were aspects of it that I enjoyed. The art looks pretty good. It's still very much in the style of the 60s for the most part, fashion wise. So there's nothing really that stands out and makes this series its own.
See, and that really, in a lot of ways, was my problem with the series. Um, it was hard for me. I have not looked at this in a while, right? But it was hard for me to reconcile this John Byrne with the John Byrne that wrote the Man of Steel miniseries in the 80s over at
Hmm.
DC. It's very much not of a cloth. Because if you look at Man of Steel over at DC, when that was released at the time, we're going to have to be honest. That sucker was innovative, okay? Like it or not at this point, like that version of Superman or not, it was a massive departure from what Superman had been, right? He doesn't get his powers until he's an adult, or in his late teens. So he has a much more normal childhood. Is actually technically born on Earth, right, in that birthing matrix, rather than being a toddler when he arrives. Um, his powers were a little weaker. He was a little more human. The idea that Clark Kent is actually the real person and not just a disguise, right? That Clark and Superman are personality-wise a little closer together, actually. All of that stuff is Byrne and was significantly different from what had come before. And so this was innovative. It was new. It was different, and it worked, right? And so then seeing this, it's exactly the opposite. It's basically a rehash, right? There's nothing really innovative here. There's nothing really new here. This is basically just.
Vulture straight up murders a guy. That's different.
I mean, yeah, but that's what I'm saying, right? Like like even a lot of the covers are basically just like redrawn covers from the Lee Ditko era, right? There's nothing really additive in this series. It's just the details have changed, if that makes sense, right? So they go in here and they're changing some details, but the overall story and who the character is and the kind of stuff that happens and the villains that he encounters, that stuff is pretty much the same. So I didn't quite understand the point of the series if you're not going to do something interesting with it, like modernizing an old story doesn't mean now this story has computers in it. Like, does that make
Yeah.
sense? Because at one point, like Uncle Ben gifts Peter a computer, and I'm like, you think that's what makes this a story set in the late '90s?
Yeah.
Like even like in the first issue, when you have your first like little flashback moment where it's like, I probably wonder how I got here. When they do that, the panels that are inserted, and it was so glaringly obvious, was straight up panels from Amazing Fantasy 15, right down to like his teacher saying, "If you keep that up, lad, you're going to get a scholarship," and he says, "I do my
Yep.
best, sir." Right? It's the exact same dialogue,
Yep.
even, and I'm like, this is not like, you're not even really telling your own story here. You're just like you're retelling somebody else's story, and I know this is like this is going to sound harsh, perhaps, but to me, it almost felt a little bit like asking AI to rewrite a story, right? And it just like
Yeah.
changes a few little details, but the rest of it is intact. And so I don't understand why you would read this over the original Lee Ditko run at that point. Like, it's not additive in any way, shape, or form, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the thing that really burned me up, there are some changes that worked fine. I think the one instance that was interesting was like the alien invasion being like a staging for something else. Like they weren't really aliens. That was an interesting wrinkle that actually worked for me. But then you mentioned the computer. That was so tone deaf for me and so out of character for Uncle Ben to be instead of paying rent, I'm gonna buy my nephew a computer. And so like that just doesn't ring true for me. And the so like you have the one instance where it actually was kind of interesting and intriguing and worked out, but then for the most part it was just a bunch of, I don't know if edgelordy is the word, like the explosion in the lab, like the computer bit. It just none of it really added anything.
Yeah. That seems to be the problem. And even the things that he did in this series that had potential um, to be interesting, right? Ended up not being very interesting for some reason. Like interesting idea to link Spider-Man's origin in with one of his villains, right? Not a bad idea. And then he really didn't do much with that, with the whole like Doc Ock thing,
It's
right?
Mary Jane as well. Like, oh, we're bringing Mary Jane much earlier than she was in the original Amazing Spider-Man run. But does that anything come of that? Nope. She just sees him as Spider-Man flying out the window, and then nothing comes of that.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think it's fascinating then that those concepts, the exact same ideas, Mary Jane is there earlier, there's a villain linked into his origin, are all things that our next origin that we're going to talk about, not to put the cart before the horse, Ultimate Spider-Man by Bendis and Bagley actually pick up the same ideas and then actually do really interesting things with them. So it makes it retroactively even more obvious what sort of just dead on arrival series this Spider-Man Chapter 1 is. It's just such an odd, it's such an odd thing. Like it literally feels in some ways like Byrne is saying, yeah, Lee Ditko did an okay job, but I'll just go through and I'll proofread them and make it a little better now. Like it's not even like I'm telling my own version of the story. It's like I'm like proofreading them or editing them, or it's just very weird.
Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, no less.
Yeah, it's the weirdest. It's the weirdest origin story revision that I have probably ever read. And I have read a lot of origin story revisions because remember, the DC Universe reboots every 10 years or so. So I've seen a lot of origin stories as a comic book fan. This is probably one of the weirdest I've seen.
It's interesting because some of the goofy campiness of the 1960s, like I'm specifically thinking of the entire ethos of introduction, the vibes of the introduction of the Green Goblin. It's silly, it's goofy, it's campy, but I'm willing to give that real estate to Lee and Ditko because they're building this from the ground up. But for Byrne to come by and just like he's essentially like an inker. He's like inking the pencils that are already drawn, and I don't want to diminish inkers and the contributions they make to the comic book industry, but like he's kind of just further imprinting like the silliness and the campiness. So you're not really updating anything. You can add a little computer here or there, but you're not shaking up anything else. And the goblin stuff really was just like okay for me. Like it just why are you here? Osborne Studios is objectively hilarious though.
Osborne Studios. Like, that guy had his fingers in everything. Like, what is up
Right.
with that guy? That is
Yeah.
so weird. Like, I'm a
The
titan of
Rupert the Rupert
industry, and
Murdoch the Rupert Murdoch of the Marvel
yeah,
universe.
it's just very odd. And that brings us then to our third origin story that we read. It's probably no secret that both of us have some fondness for this one and some nostalgia. And that is Ultimate Spider-Man. We looked at the first 6 issues of a pretty long-running series, which was written by Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Mark Bagley. Initially, I think the story pitch also featured input by Bill Jemas. This was published between 2000 and 2001. So It's hard to believe that Ultimate Spider-Man is that long in the tooth now. Considering I was there, I read it as it was being released.
We're on our third volume of it, so we had to distinguish with volume 1 here.
Yeah, this is crazy. So, Ultimate Spider-Man, this is not an attempt to replace the 616 origin story, but was an attempt to update the character for a new generation by retelling his origin story, and then just like kind of running with it and let it continue on and see where the story goes in an alternate universe. The Ultimate line obviously ended up being like a whole big line that ran for a long time, then died off, and now is being relaunched in another alternate universe. So there's a lot of history here, but Ultimate Spider-Man was sort of the starting point. Chris, I'm very interested to once again talk Ultimate Spider-Man with you because we've talked about this one before, and for some reason it never gets old to talk about it.
It never does. It's like putting on a favorite article of clothing, playing a favorite video game from your youth. Even though I didn't find this until my 20s, so I it's it's not as nostalgic as it might be for you because I wasn't actively reading comics until my late teens and early 20s. But it's still like it still holds up. There's stuff inevitably, 24 years later that does not age well. There's some, but at the same time, that's how gym teachers talked to underperforming male athletes in the year 2000 because I was one of those said athletes. My athletic career was very short.
You and me both, my friend. True
um,
nerds.
so yeah, some of the stuff hasn't aged well, but some of the ways that people talk to each other in the year 2000, 2001 did not age well. Um, so it was really, really interesting. I've always been here for hippie Uncle Ben. As a fellow long-haired gentleman, I'm always going to go up for that. But like, he lived in a commune before he met May, so that's kind of fascinating. I kind of want a little bit more into that than what we got. Um, Crusher Hogan having his initials tattooed on his forehead but not centered is hilarious. It was really hard to cut off at issue 6. I wanted to just keep going. I just wanted to. I was like, "Am I? I'm doing. I'm so torn and do so many different places. There's so many shows I need to get caught up on. There's so much content. There's so many games I want to play, and I'm like, I really can't afford to do another Ultimate Spider-Man reread because I know it sounds disingenuous because I just said I don't like to reread or revisit stuff, but this is one of those exceptions where it never gets old. It's always something new that I'm picking up from this. This transported me back to middle school, like because that's I was in sixth, seventh grade when this was set in 2000 2001. So I mean, it's just it continues to hold up, and like you said with the ideas that Byrne kind of hinted at, but poorly executed, they pick it up and run with it here, and it's done so well. From the onset, having Mary Jane there from day one is a really fascinating change. I also actually buy J. Jonah Jameson as a journalist, and it's not the I don't know if I buy Stan Lee's uh saying that it's based on him. Maybe it is. Stan. Like he liked revisionist stuff. He was a carnival barker. So I really enjoy. I mean, we know where the story goes with Ultimate Jonah. I love it. Um, and so I just it's like eating your favorite dish, and it just never disappoints, man. I love Ultimate Spider-Man. I could read this day in day out. It's just so good. Where while it took me forever to get through chapter 1, um I read through all 6 of these issues rather quickly, and I'm a slow reader, man.
Yeah, this one is, if you look at like the first 5 issues, we read the first 6, right? But if you look at the first 5 issues are basically a decompressed version of Amazing Fantasy 15. That's really all that's there. Like it's 5 issues to retell Amazing Fantasy 15, what was originally told in 11 pages. But whereas I'm usually not a big fan of decompression, there are so many beautiful layers that Ultimate Spider-Man adds to that story. I mean, is it updated? Is the technology updated? Does it take place in then modern day? Yes, all of that, right? But I think there are characters that really shine, and by giving them some more breathing room. I think in particular Peter really shines here. Going through the kind of bullying that he goes through here, you really have a completely different sort of level of empathy for him and for what he's going through. And I think that kind of connection between the reader and the character is invariably a good thing, right? Um, I think that Ben really shines here as well. I think that Uncle Ben is
Oh,
a pretty
this might be
flat
my favorite
character,
Uncle
right?
Ben. This is
This
probably
is
my favorite
this
Uncle Ben.
this is Uncle Ben to me. Like when I think of Uncle Ben, this is who I think of every time. I think this is the version of Uncle Ben that is sort of um, definite to me, I guess. But yeah, he really shines. Just the way he is as a parent, the way he is with Peter, how he's trying to get through to him when Peter's going through stuff. The level of patience. I love even when him and May are like sending Peter to his room, as punishment, and then they look at each other and like, this'll pass, it'll be all right. He's okay.
Yeah.
He's just going through something. It's like there's no anger there. That's just good parenting. It's like I know what I need to do. I know he needs to be he needs to be disciplined, but it'll be okay. He's a good kid. He's just going through something. And that's in Amazing Fantasy 15 they come across both Ben and May come across as this really like well-meaning older couple, right? Like, oh, here's some wheat cakes. But here they're really they're very textured characters and they're very interesting in their own right from the get-go. And so when you get to the point where Ben where Ben buys the farm, you really feel that loss, not just because oh no, poor Peter, but also, oh crap, here's a character that I really liked that I'm not going to be able to spend any more time with, right? It's like a
Yeah.
loss not just to Peter but even to the reader.
Yes.
That's just smart writing, right? And as we've said previously, like connecting Peter's origin to a villain is interesting, but doing it with Norman Osborn rather than Doc Ock makes a lot more sense,
Well,
right?
Doc Ock is there, but
Yeah,
not as directly. Right.
yeah. And then, of course, having Mary Jane there early on, and then making her sort of that girl next door and a close friend of Peter's, and there's this flirtation there, and he's sort of oblivious. Like all of that is just like perfect high school drama stuff, right? And really, Spider-Man, even going all the way back to the Lee Ditko era, is really like very soap opera-y, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
something else I think that Chapter One was missing. It kind of felt like he was just going from villain to villain, and the
Mm-hmm.
soap opera stuff was happening sort of off screen, right? But here you have a series that leans into that part of Spider-Man, and that I think is very much needed.
I think what's fascinating to me, and like I said earlier, is like you learn something new every time you revisit something, every time you rewatch or reread. What I noticed this time, and you reminded me of it when you were talking about issues 1 through 5 being A of 15, essentially, is there is so much space to let things sink in this series. Like there are pages where it's just facial expressions and there's so much story being told between Ben and Peter or Ben and May with just the looks. There's no script. And that's fascinating. And a tip of the cap to Mark Bagley, who I already think the world of. But there's so much storytelling going on when there is no words in these first 6 issues. And it's really just fascinating to me. And I'm trying to find the issue. It's indefensible that it's one of my favorite panels and line reads in or one of my favorite lines in all of comics, and I can't ever pinpoint the exact issue. But and we talk about it with giving grace to Lee and Ditko because they're building this thing as they go along. And so like the whole with great power there must also come great responsibility. Inarguably one of the most quoted, misquoted, and powerful lines in the history of comic books and the history of media. But there's a way that Bendis redoes it later on. I think it's after he defeats Craven in Ultimate, where he's like, someone once told me, with great power, there must also come. I'm paraphrasing, and he's like, so that's what I'm going to stick to. And everything else is just noise. And that's really stayed with me ever since I read it for the first time, that everything else is just noise. And I think that's the staying power of Ultimate Ben. And that's why he'll always be my favorite Ben, is because we got to see him pass that off. I know we always attribute that quote to Ben or Richard. And it wasn't even there in the origin. It wasn't there in AF-15. And so like that's the benefit of hindsight. And I mean, Ultimate Spider-Man will always have a place in my heart, man.
Mine too. I think it's a really, really special run. Absolutely. So looking at yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I want to before we do like our final thing here, and I had hinted at this, but we've already done so much reading for this episode. Are you caught up on volume 3, I guess it is, of Ultimate, the Hickman stuff? Are you caught up on that?
I think I might be one issue behind.
How would you compare that to what we've read here?
Um, that's a really interesting question. I I think that the current Ultimate series is very much popular, right? Because it
Hmm.
is giving an older married Peter Parker, which is something I think a lot of fans have been clamoring for. I don't necessarily think, so far at least, um, that it is as good as this, the original Ultimate Spider-Man run. I think that there is some ethos still missing here, right? Like, I think there's interesting twists happening. Like, for example, the fact that, the power and responsibility shtick comes from Harry Osborn. I thought that was a really interesting twist on that, right? But the other shoe hasn't dropped there yet, if that makes sense, right? Which is what is going to make that line meaningful and impactful in the long run to Peter. Is something going to happen to Harry? Is Harry going to go evil? And what is that going to mean? Well, how is that going to color you know Peter's morality? Because right now Peter basically, not to be not to delve too far into like spoiler territory or whatnot, but right now Peter is, for all intents and purposes, midlife crisis Spider-Man, right? Like the moral drive that Spider-Man has, I don't think is necessarily there yet, right? Like, I should be more. I think I'm missing out on something. Therefore, I'm gonna let the spider bite me and become a superhero. Is cute and all, and it's interesting that he got the chance to choose it this time, right? But I'm still waiting for the moral trigger that keeps him in the game. Because if you look at Spider-Man stories, there's always that, like, well, why doesn't he quit? Why doesn't he quit? Look how miserable he is. Why doesn't he just stop this? And it's always because he has that moral drive to do what's right. And that is something that I'm not seeing in this new series yet, and I'm waiting for it.
Ah, I can tell you're an issue behind. No,
Okay.
no, I don't know that it answers all of the questions that you have, but this last issue was really, really strong for me. Um, I think what my take on it is, I have long been um a person who has said, it's been nearly 20 years. The marriage is over. Like, let everybody move on. So that advent of it, I get why it's popular. I get the whatever. But I think and this is for me, the Ultimate universe at large. Ultimate's number one really grabbed me, fascinated me. I love what Ultimate Black Panther's doing. This entire line has been fascinating to me, and I think it's so interesting because it's so markedly different. Like, it's like, even with this first volume of Ultimate Spider-Man, it's pretty much like the same baseline story. There are distinct differences, but like the the forks in the road, or the landmarkers, I should say, are still there. And this is so different is what's fascinating to me. And I don't want to compare the volumes necessarily for quality's sake, but I just think it's interesting that it is so different than any of these three that we've compared here.
It's definitely not trying to retell anything, right? It's definitely, going down its own path. And I think that's probably the biggest strength of the series. You really truly don't know where the sucker's going. Um, and having read previous Spider-Man stories is not going to be any benefit for you here, right? And I think that is my favorite thing by far about the series, is that it's completely it's completely forging its own path here.
And I would add on to that, but I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's not caught up. Um, but yeah, I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, so far I'm too. I definitely need to read that new issue then. Alrighty, so between the three origins then that we have looked at today, which one would you say, Chris, is your favorite?
There's an old adage, Dave. Why do you ask a question to which you already know the answer? No, that's an unfair thing too. Um, uh, uh, because Ultimate Spider-Man is just always going to be very special to me. Um, it was one of the first things. It's not the first comic I read. It's not the first comic series I read. It's not the first Spider-Man series I read. I started with 616 ASM, and so, but it was probably the first comic where, and I'm a slow reader, but so for me to read the entire Peter story on one winter break over 2 weeks, that's really saying something. And so I think it's like an unfair comparison, but I really have a lot of love for those old Lee Ditko issues, and this is no slight to Steve Ditko, but I much prefer the art style of John Romita. And so the Lee Romita was one of my favorite eras of Spider-Man. So I'll always have love for the older stuff. And this is no slight at John Byrne, but like that just did not work for me in any form or fashion.
Yeah, I think for me it's basically the same thing. Ultimate is by far my favorite, right? But I think it's incredible how well the early Amazing stuff still holds up. I think that kind of blows my mind. It really, really holds up. Whereas I think Chapter One does not, and I don't know. I don't know why this version of John Byrne came to the party and not the one that did Man of Steel. Maybe, this is what editorial asked him to do. I don't know. Maybe it was, just retell what came before and slightly update it. Maybe they didn't give him
Just
free
add
reign like they did
just add
with
Donald
Superman.
yeah,
Yeah.
just add Donald Trump and Mel Gibson references.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wow, those aged like milk too. So I don't know if that was like editorial, mandate, or if that is how he decided to approach it. Either way, it was he chose poorly in Indiana Jones speak.
I think for me, I appreciate. We talked about this in our text thread. We're not fans of explicit cultural references like that. But I much more appreciate like when it's like a subliminal thing, like the style of clothing or what have you, where it's almost like I've said this before, but like you're in a time capsule or you're time traveling, and it's much more subliminal like that, and it's not forced. Like I feel like a lot of those references they try to like be relevant and look how cool and hip we are, and that's not without saying we didn't even dive into Byrne writing teenagers. So yeah.
Alrighty, folks, there you have it. What is your favorite Spider-Man origin story? Hit us up on social media at NerdByWord or individually at ThatNerdDave and at ThatNerdChris. We are going to take a short break, and when we come back, it's going to be time for some nerd commendations. So stick around. And we're back, and it's time for everybody's favorite segment where we recommend some new nerdy media to you. We call it our
Commendations.
Chris, what is good this week?
Well, I read this a couple of weeks back. It's Doom #1. It's a giant-sized one-shot, written and penciled by Sanford Greene, who is famous for Bitterroot, which is something I'm desperately trying to get around to reading. And some of the writing is also done by Jonathan Hickman. So it is. As I said, a giant-sized one-shot in the near future about Doctor Doom, and it's like this space adventure. Valeria Richards. I don't want to spoil too much by giving it away, but I'll just read the synopsis here. In the near future, Doom alone must save the Marvel Universe. Legendary creators Jonathan Hickman and Sanford Greene send Doctor Doom on a journey unlike any he has undertaken before. With Valeria Richards as his side, Doom goes on a quest to harness more power than any human has ever wielded before in order to try to stop Galactus from bringing about the death of the universe. Just some of the best splash pages and visuals that you'll see in modern comic books. Sanford Greene is just really um, visually arresting in this book, and it further reminded me that I need to go read Bitterroot because I've had it highly recommended by friends. But as a Doctor Doom fan, not like I'm caping up for pun intended his antics or anything, but he's one of my favorite villains to read. He's always messy, he's always dramatic, he's always sassy a little bit. So I love reading Doctor Doom stories. I care much less about the Fantastic Four. They're just kind of like meh to me. But Doctor Doom is, I'm always here for a Doctor Doom story. And this one did not disappoint.
Yeah, I like Doctor Doom as well, so I'm gonna have to go ahead and I'm gonna have to check that out because it definitely sounds very, very interesting. And I'm always, here for a visually arresting comic book.
All right, Dave. So now this is this another Steam Deck segment? We're becoming bit players here.
Uh, Kind of, I guess. It's not necessarily just Steam Deck, right? I mean, there are other places you can play the sucker, but yes. So I've previously nerd commended a PC port of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, which is called Ship of Harkinian. And the Ship of Harkinian is really cool for a number of reasons. So they decompiled the source code, right? You have to bring your own ROM to the party for the assets, right? But then you can actually play the game in widescreen at higher resolutions. You can find texture packs online to use high-res textures with it. You can fiddle with the control scheme, including giving it free camera control, like a modern game, right? So you twin stick it instead of having that old N64 single stick control. And I've really enjoyed revisiting Ocarina of Time with some modern bells and whistles to it. Well, lo and behold, if not too long ago, and it completely passed me by, I just heard about it. I think it was at the end of May, the same people that created Ship of Harkinian had now tackled the sequel to Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, the much weirder, creepier, and darker cousin of Ocarina of Time, and a game that I've always really loved and appreciated for how weird and odd it is, and I've not been able to replay it for many years. And the reason for that is that I always have to go back to the original N64 version. Nintendo did a re-release of the game, sort of a port to the 3DS, but they fiddled with so many things under the hood that it really didn't feel as good to play anymore. And I'm not going to get into all the details on that. But let's just say that this new PC port of Majora's Mask, which is lovingly referred to as To Ship to Harkinian, in a tribute to the original sequel to The Fast and the Furious, Too Fast, Too Furious. To Ship to Harkinian is bringing so far all the same stuff to the table as the original Ship of Harkinian. Support for higher frame rates, frame buffer effects, the ability to use high resolution textures, free look, so you can have complete camera control, you can edit the HUD, all these really cool things, widescreen support that makes it possible to play the game in all sorts of, new bells and whistles. And you can do this on all sorts of different platforms, including on PC, and yes, on Linux distributions, which means you can put this sucker on a Steam Deck. And that's how I'm currently experiencing it. And it is one heck of an experience to take Majora's Mask on the go with you and have all these modern bells and whistles to it as well. So, to ship to Harkinian, if you're a little bit tech savvy and you know how to get to it, I highly recommend it. It's totally awesome way to play a classic Zelda game, Chris.
Why do I feel like the audio of that segment is going to be accompanied by Sarah McLachlan's In the Arms of the Angel because Nintendo has found you? It's been a pleasure doing this show with you. As a recent convert to PC gaming, and as someone who was deeply frustrated by the Nintendo Switch Online port of Ocarina of Time, I may have to give this a look, see if I enjoy it a little bit better, because the N64 controls, as I've shared with you before, do not work well on a Switch, and it does not make me happy.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now, man, since you have entered the PC gaming arena, you can play this on PC, and it's an absolute delight. Like I put everything on my Steam Deck these days because that's just how I roll. But I'll just tell you up front, like this is the definite version to experience these games to me is these PC ports. They're absolutely marvelous. Alrighty, folks, there you have it. That's it for episode 196 of the Nerd Byword podcast. If you like what you just heard, please find us on social media and let us know what you thought of the episode and the various topics we discussed this week. You can find us at Nerd Byword or individually at @NerdDave and at @NerdChris.
And if you like what you heard today, you can also like and subscribe on your podcasting platform of choice, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, you name it, we're there. Also, nerdbyword.com. And as always, stay well and stay nerdy.
The Nerd Byword is written and produced by Chris and Dave, two nerds with a love of all things pop culture. The podcast features music by Al Jimenez with additional drops composed by Joe Biondi. Our show art is by Ashery Design. Find us at nerdbyword.com and wherever podcasts are available.